So one of the world's favorite heroes, for many different reasons, Levia. Now, out in the road to nationals and the world classic constructed meta, not too many Levias out there. And if I say so myself, in your one Levia game in Devastation, despite what, 3-4 ones?
4 ones, I think, and 2 6.
Yeah, you still put up pretty full-on fights. So tell us, what are your thoughts about Levia out in the open? And I don't know, is there anything we're missing?
Well, that Levia versus Dorothea, it's a very high variance matchup to go, not because of the die rolls, but more just because how it kind of plays out. So it was, I would actually say the reason I was unlucky in that Levia matchup was not because I rolled lots of ones, but because I drew my defense reactions at the same time, even though I run so little of them, as well as his turn 1 dealing me, I think, 9 damage did not help. In terms of Levia, I actually think a lot of people now see my list and people kind of think it's oh, this is just a day 1 list. Jason doesn't know what he's doing. How does he win with this deck? Actually, so what I actually believe is when people first started playing Levia, their list was actually quite decently close to what I actually prefer as a really good list. And it was never the list that was the biggest problem. There was a few cards that always needs to be adjusted, and those cards are usually quite critical. But more importantly, people's game plan is really incorrect right now being played with Levia. Levia is not a control deck. It has control aspects, but it is not a pure essence control deck. If you play Levia in a way where you're defending, fueling your graveyard and hope to kill your opponent later on, the reality is you don't actually kill your opponent later on. What Levia does excel at is when you draw certain sequences of cards, you defend heavily and therefore become that control deck that I just talked about, but that should never be your original game plan. And the amount of times I played a matchup of defending heaps, having 20 cards in my graveyard before going off, I only do that 5-10% of the time. What's way more important in Levia is explosive turns, and the key difference between Levia to other decks that go off, say Kaino or Chain or Rhino that have explosive turns, is Levia can have back-to-back explosive turns just because of how many different things you can do. For example, Levia is actually one of the best Mandible Claws deck. You have multiple ways to discard. You don't only have Blood Rush Ella, which is great. You also have stuff like Shadow of Blasphemy. You also have your Deadwood Rumbler. These type of cards, they already are good in your deck, but you can have really good turns with it. Now you also have your big Art of War turns and being able to do recurrent stuff. But in addition to this, whenever you just have a low-key turn, you just roll with Scabskin, and when you do roll a 4 or higher, you can there's certain turns where if you had 1 action point, you're not attacking for too much, but when you have 2, it opens up a huge amount of windows. And when you're playing Levia, you just have to be constantly thinking about okay, so how much damage am I doing if I instead get set up for a rolling legs? And a lot of time you actually do just choose I want to defend, but there's just so many moving parts, and you also want to set up your Art of War, set up your Blood Rush Bellows in the correct turn, and it's just about swinging momentum, because unlike other heroes, Levia is this really random hero of just I randomly do 24 in a turn and it doesn't take much, whereas Chain to do 24 in a turn is, Chain's going to do 24 to you on a turn when it's turn 7 and they have 6 shackles, or they have double Art of War, or they're getting ready. Levia can do this at any time because all of the cards are just it's just a random mesh of cards, almost like a toolbox deck. And the best way for you to actually really learn Levia is you just have to keep on playing and don't just switch cards. Don't play Levia and be oh, this card sucks, I'm switching it. Keep playing with it because every card has a use, even though some percentage of time they're useless.
Yeah, it's such a toolbox deck. That's the perfect word for it. And I've played a few games with Levia myself, and even without changing the cards in the list, every game is so different. And I think practice really does make perfect with it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like you said, one of Levia's biggest strengths is it's not linear, which means it's really hard to combat it. Like if I want to beat Chain, I know what Chain's roughly doing every single game, but Levia is completely different.
So we talked about how Levia is so unique, that flexibility and those toolbox aspects. What kind of specific good and bad matchups does Levia have out there?
So the good matchups for Levia is any deck that runs very linearly. So what this means is like you can kind of predict how much your damage output is throughout the game. Like if I just mapped out the whole game of what they're going to do, I can kind of gauge what they're going to do. So examples like this is I really like playing Levia against decks like Katsu Control. I love playing it against Chain. I don't so much like Bravo because the fact that you have to bounce when they're going to do big crippling crushes versus when they don't. That's not too linear to me when I'm playing Levia. The other matchups I absolutely hate playing against Levia is Kaino, and I absolutely hate playing against Bolton OTK with Levia. But by far with Levia, my favorite matchup is decks like Katsu, which I was really hoping that Newsom would pair Katsu into my Levia, but I think he also knew this, and also really nice against Chain.
Cool. Let's talk about Kaino. So he's a very, very unique character, but what are some of his really good and maybe not so good matchups out there in the current world classic constructed meta?
Yeah, so Kaino, as I feel like it's one of those kind of heroes that can do extremely well in certain matchups. Obviously, matchups that when people don't have null runes, of course, it's easier. But I feel in general, it does well against decks like Chain. It's kind of like a silver bullet type against Chain, especially a lot of lists that don't run null rune would struggle. I think, but even with my game against Jason, I felt that Kaino was my best shot against Jason's lineup because against if you manage to deal enough damage that kind of forces them to pitch away their blue cards and then have a weaker turn on their turn, chances are that they'll take a couple of damage, lose a couple of life to things like Blood Debt. And I really wanted to use Chains of Eminence to punish Jason, but unfortunately I misnamed the card. I should have gone for Seas. It's, I guess, the one of those things that was just like afterwards. Wow. But I feel like that Kaino can have a really good game against Chain, but again, it's one of those heroes that you need a lot of experience with. And things like Aether Flare, Reverberate, those can create those breakpoints where you hit them for 4, and it's just that that damage that they can't prevent it unless they have null rune 4, which most of them don't. So it's a good way to hinder Chain's ability to kind of go off, and it puts pressure on them early. But you have to know what you're doing, and unfortunately, I got Kaino as my last pick. I didn't really have time to practice, and I wish I could have done all the Wizard fans proud a little bit more, but I feel like if I knew what I was doing in my game against Jason, I would have smashed him.
Well, sounds like a pretty cool matchup, and hopefully you see the old Dracai of Aether a bit more often in these top tables. I wouldn't be surprised.
But things like, if you're versing something like a Guardian with null rune 4, for example, it becomes really tough, because in Blitz, Kaino is doing extremely well, whereas in CC you don't really see that much of a representation in Kaino, and it's purely because of the difference in life. In Blitz, dealing 20 damage to someone is just so much easier with Kaino than playing that kind of game of attrition where you're trying to get their life total low enough so you can do your kind of chain of spells and burn them to 0 life. It is doable. Like Kaino did get a few goodies from Monarch. You have the Nourishing Emptiness. And yeah, I think it's just it's a really it's one of those decks that is very metagame dependent. There can be a specific metagame where you see a lot of maybe aggro decks, maybe a lot of these really slow control decks, that aggro decks that don't run null runes so you can race them, control decks that might not have put enough pressure but don't have access to null rune equipment either. So I feel like there's definitely metagames that open up that Kaino can do really well with. But it doesn't seem to be happening that often recently.
Right time, right place sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So what are your thoughts on some of the different types of ways to build Kaino, and what kind of evolutions have happened since Monarch?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Kaino, I feel like you can build it depending on whether you want to race someone or whether you want to kind of set up a big turn. And we've seen in the blitz calling, for example, Jason Long, before the release of Monarch, Jason Long kind of showcased a one-turn kill Kaino where you pitch stack your deck, you put things like the Forked Lightning, Still Aether ones, and 2 Blazing Aethers on the bottom of your deck, and then bam, at the end of the game, you just kind of deal a bunch of damage. And I feel like the challenge of taking that strategy into Classic Constructed is the fact that you need to go through your whole deck and there's like just 20
A lot more cards.
Yeah. And you know, that kind of gameplay can be very effective against these kind of control matchups, but it does require a lot of mental, basically mental stamina. You have to, if you're doing that and you're planning to do it at Road to Nationals event, you need to do it like 10, maybe between 8 to 10 games in a row. So I feel like that's why we haven't really seen that much of that kind of one-turn kill strategy. And we've seen a lot more of people going for either trying to push through damage over null rune, so setting up things like Stir the Aether Winds into a Vaulted Bolt or into a Forked Lightning and repeating that a few times. I feel like that is one strategy where you kind of try and push through over the top of null runes and eventually win by kind of defending, saving your life total until you push that through, or you see a strategy that's very much based on trying to smash in, trying to race damage with things like Aether Flare and Reverberate. Aether Flare is a card that kind of can be built around in the sense that because of the damage amplification, you can really punish people for ignoring basically what you're doing, and pushing something like an Aether Flare for 4 or 5 into Blazing Aether, and all of a sudden your opponent's taking 15 damage out of like 2 cards, which can be pretty powerful, but again, it requires quite a bit of setup, it requires knowledge of the deck, and it's just not that easy to pull off. So I feel like there will be kind of players around the world who have had practice with Kaino from the kind of skirmish season and the blitz season, and they will be able to do extremely well with, or when the metagame basically allows you to punish people with Kaino.
Yeah,